When three business professionals publicly humiliated an elderly Navy veteran, they never expected a group of Hell's Angels bikers to walk through the door and change everything in an instant. What happens when society's most feared outsiders become the unexpected guardians of respect and honor for those who served our country? The sun was barely up when Frank Matthews put on his old blue Navy cap. The gold letters that said USS Nimitz were fading, but Frank could still feel them with his fingers. He looked at himself in the mirror. His white hair stuck out from under the cap. His face had deep lines, like a map of all the places he had been. Frank was 78 years old now, but his blue eyes were still sharp and clear. Every Tuesday morning for the last 10 years, Frank walked 6 blocks to Joe's coffee shop. Rain or shine, hot or cold, Frank never missed his Tuesday coffee. The walk helped his stiff legs, even if they hurt a bit more these days. Joe's coffee shop sat on the corner of Oak and Main. The red brick building had been there for over 50 years. The sign above the door was hand-painted, with a big coffee cup that steamed. The bell on the door jingled as Frank pushed it open at exactly 8:15 a.m. "Morning, Frank," called Marissa from behind the counter. Her bright red hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and her smile was as warm as the coffee she served. "The usual?" Frank nodded and headed to his corner table by the window. He could see the whole shop from there and watch people walking by outside. The wooden chair creaked as he sat down. The table had a small chip on one edge that Frank's thumb always found, like an old friend. "1 black coffee. No sugar in your blue mug," Marissa said, placing the cup in front of him. Steam rose from the dark liquid, bringing the rich smell of fresh coffee to Frank's nose. "Thank you, dear," Frank said, his voice a bit rough from not talking much at home. "How's that boy of yours doing in school?" "Tommy got an A on his history test about World War II, Marissa beamed. "He said he remembered all those stories you told him." Frank smiled. He liked sharing his stories with Tommy. The boy listened with wide eyes, not like most kids these days who only cared about their phones and games. Frank opened his newspaper and took a sip of his coffee. The warmth spread through his chest, chasing away the morning chill. The coffee shop was filling up with the morning crowd. The hiss of the coffee machine and the quiet talk of people made Frank feel less alone. Frank's fingers touched the metal hidden under his flannel shirt. He never showed it to anyone, but he always wore it. 27 men. That's how many he couldn't save when the big storm hit their ship in '72. Some nights, he still heard their voices in his dreams. "More coffee, Frank?" asked Joe himself, a big man with kind eyes and hands rough from years of work. Joe had opened the shop after coming home from the Gulf War. He always had time for Frank. "Not yet, Joe. Still working on this one," Frank replied, holding up his blue mug. "How's that knee doing?" "Better since the new medicine," Joe said. "Say, you coming to the Veterans Day thing next week at the park?" Frank nodded. "Wouldn't miss it. Been to everyone since they started." The morning sun now filled the shop, making the wooden floors glow golden. Frank could smell fresh muffins coming from the kitchen. His newspaper had stories about places he'd been long ago. Some good memories, some not so good. The bell over the door jingled again. 3 young men walked in, talking loudly. They wore fancy shirts with no wrinkles and shiny shoes that had never seen hard work. Frank could tell by the way they walked that they thought they were important. "I'm telling you, these budget cuts are needed," said the tallest one as they got in line. "The military gets too much money anyway." "Yeah, and half those old vets just sit around collecting checks," said another, his voice sharp and mean. Frank pretended not to hear. He had learned long ago that some fights weren't worth having. He turned the page of his newspaper, but his hands weren't steady anymore. The young men got their coffees and looked for a place to sit. The shop was getting full now. Frank could feel them looking at him, at his Navy cap. "Hey, look at Grandpa Navy over there," the tall one said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Bet he's been taking up that table all morning." Frank's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes on his paper. The words blurred a bit. Not from tears, he told himself. His eyes were just tired. "Hey, old-timer," called the tall man, walking closer to Frank's table. "Did you actually do anything in the Navy, or did you just wear that hat to get free coffee?" Some people in the shop looked down at their tables. Others pretended not to hear. Marissa frowned from behind the counter, but she had customers waiting. "I asked you a question, sir," the man said, now standing right by Frank's table. His two friends laughed behind him. "Still living off our tax dollars after all these years?" Frank looked up slowly. The young man's face was smug, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Frank thought about all the men he had served with, the ones who came home, the ones who didn't. The metal felt heavy against Frank's chest. His hand trembled slightly as he set down his newspaper. The coffee shop seemed very quiet now, though Frank could hear his heart beating in his ears. "I served 22 years in the United States Navy," Frank said quietly. "Enlisted when I was 18, but I don't owe you my story, son." The tall man leaned closer. Frank could smell his fancy cologne and coffee breath. "Bet you just pushed papers on some safe little base, right?" "My tax dollars at work." Frank's fingers touched the edge of his newspaper. He remembered the storm that hit the Nimitz, waves as tall as buildings, the roar of water and wind, the screams of men being swept overboard. Frank had tied himself to a rail with his belt to save 3 young sailors, but couldn't reach 27 others in time. "You can think what you want," Frank said, his voice steady now. "I know what I did." "Oh, we've got a tough guy," laughed the second man, spilling a bit of his coffee on Frank's newspaper. "Sorry about that, Grandpa." Frank looked down at the brown stains spreading across the paper. It wasn't really about the paper. It was about respect. The kind that seemed harder to find these days. "I was a rescue swimmer, and later a chief petty officer," Frank said. "I served in Vietnam and 2 Gulf Wars. Lost good friends, but you wouldn't understand that kind of friendship." The third young man, who had been quiet until now, pulled out his phone. "This is gold." Old man getting triggered about his glory days. He held up the phone like he was taking a video. A few people in the shop looked uncomfortable. An old woman shook her head. A young mother gathered her children closer, but no one said anything. "Please leave me be," Frank said, feeling very tired suddenly. "I just want to drink my coffee in peace." "Public place, old man," said the tall one, pulling out a chair at Frank's table and sitting down without asking. "Free country. Isn't that what you fought for?" Frank's hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from anger and hurt. He thought about his wife, Sarah, who had waited for him through 3 tours, who had raised their son mostly alone while Frank was at sea, who had held him through the nightmares when he came home. Sarah had been gone 5 years now. Cancer. Sometimes Frank still reached for her in the night. "That's my table," Frank said. "I sit there every Tuesday." "Don't see your name on it," smirked the man, spreading his arms wide. His sleeve knocked Frank's blue mug, spilling hot coffee across the table and onto Frank's lap. Frank jumped up, the hot liquid burning through his pants. His newspaper was soaked. Coffee dripped onto the floor. "Whoa, careful there, Grandpa Navy," laughed the tall man, not moving to help. "Don't break a hip." Marissa rushed over with a cloth. "Are you okay, Frank?" She shot an angry look at the young men. "You guys need to leave him alone." "We're paying customers," said the second man. "And we're just having a friendly chat with the veteran here." Frank dabbed at his wet pants with a napkin. His hands were shaking so badly now that he dropped it twice. The burn on his leg stung, but the shame hurt worse. In his pocket was the photo of his old crew. 18 men standing proud on the deck of the Nimitz. Only 7 made it to their last reunion. "I think I should go," Frank said, reaching for his cap that had fallen on the floor. As he bent down, his back seized up. A sharp pain made him gasp. The metal around his neck slipped out from under his shirt, dangling in the open. "Well, look at that," said the tall man, pointing. "Grandpa's got himself a fancy medal. What's that for? Keeping your desk chair warm?" Frank tucked the medal back under his shirt. It was the Navy Cross, given to him after the typhoon rescue. The second highest honor for valor. He never talked about it, never showed it off. It wasn't about glory, it was about duty. "That's a Navy Cross," said Joe, who had come over to help clean up. His voice was tight with anger. "You don't get that for pushing papers." The young men looked at each other, but didn't back down. The tall one snorted. "Probably bought it at a pawn shop. These old guys love to play dress-up." Frank's face burned. He thought about his son, Michael, who had followed him into the Navy, who had died when his helicopter went down in Afghanistan. Frank had given him his first cap, just like the one now soaked with coffee on the floor. "I need to use the restroom," Frank said, his voice cracking a little. He needed a moment alone, needed to catch his breath. "Need help getting there?" "Old-timer?" called one of the men as Frank limped toward the back of the shop. "Don't fall in." Frank closed the bathroom door behind him and leaned on the sink. His reflection in the mirror showed a face red with shame and anger. His hands gripped the edge of the sink until his knuckles turned white. He had faced enemy fire, survived storms that swallowed ships whole. But somehow, this was harder. These young men made him feel small, made his service seem small. Frank splashed cold water on his face. His pants were still wet with coffee. When he looked up again, he saw his Navy cap in the mirror, still proudly on his head. That cap had been with him through it all. It was more than cloth and thread. It was who he was. "Pull yourself together, Chief," he whispered to himself, using his old Navy rank. "You've weathered worse than this." When Frank opened the bathroom door, he could hear the young men still laughing at his table. His table. They had taken not just his spot, but his dignity. For the first time in many years, Frank Matthews wondered if all the sacrifice had been worth it. Frank took a deep breath and walked back to the main room of the coffee shop. The young men were still at his table, laughing and talking loudly. His blue mug had been pushed to the side, and coffee still dripped onto the floor. Frank's shoulders slumped a little. Maybe he should just leave. "Come back tomorrow instead." Marissa caught his eye from behind the counter. She looked sad and angry at the same time. "I'm so sorry, Frank," she mouthed silently. Frank nodded. It wasn't her fault. He looked around at the other people in the shop. Most were looking down at their phones or coffee cups, trying not to see what was happening. An older woman in the corner shook her head sadly. A young man in a business suit frowned, but then went back to his laptop. No one wanted to get involved. "I think I'll head home," Frank told Joe quietly as he passed the counter. "Those guys are jerks, Frank," Joe said. "Let me talk to them." Frank shook his head. "Not worth the trouble. I'll come back tomorrow." As Frank turned toward the door, the bell above it jingled. The sound cut through the noise of the coffee shop like a knife. Everyone looked up. 5 large men stood in the doorway. They wore black leather vests with patches on the back. The patches showed a skull with wings. Words curved above and below the skull. Hell's Angels Motorcycle Club. The men had long beards and tattoos on their arms. Their boots made heavy sounds on the wooden floor as they stepped inside. The coffee shop went very quiet. Even the young men at Frank's table stopped talking. The only sound was the soft hiss of the coffee machine behind the counter. The biggest of the bikers, a man with wide shoulders and a salt and pepper beard, looked slowly around the room. His eyes moved from person to person until they landed on Frank, standing alone by the counter. The biker's eyes narrowed as he looked at Frank's navy cap. Then his gaze shifted to the young men sitting at Frank's table, then back to Frank again. The big biker walked straight toward Frank. His boots thudded on the floor with each step. He stopped just a foot away from Frank and looked down at him. Frank didn't step back. He had faced scarier things than a biker in his life. "That's a Nimitz cap," the biker said, his voice deep and rough. "You serve on her?" Frank nodded. 22 years. Chief Petty Officer." The biker's face changed. The hard lines softened just a bit. He put out his hand. It was large, with calluses and old scars across the knuckles. "Mike Reynolds," the biker said. "My old man was Navy. Pacific Fleet, 68 to 72. Served on the Constellation." Frank took the offered hand. The handshake was firm and warm. "Frank Matthews," he said. "I was there too. Same years, different ship." Mike nodded slowly. His eyes moved to the young men again, who were now watching with wide eyes. He looked back at Frank's wet pants, the coffee stains, and the blue mug pushed to the side of the table. "That your regular table?" Mike asked, nodding toward where the 3 young men sat. "Every Tuesday for 10 years, Frank said quietly. Mike turned to look at his fellow bikers, who had spread out around the coffee shop. He gave them a small nod. As one, they moved toward Frank's table. "Excuse me, gentlemen," Mike said to the 3 young men. His voice was polite, but his eyes were not. "I believe you're sitting at this man's table." The tall young man looked up, his face a mix of surprise and fear. "We're having coffee. There are other tables." "Not for him, there aren't," Mike said. "This is his table. Every Tuesday." He put a hand on the back of one of the chairs. "I think it's time for you to move." The 3 young men looked at each other. For a moment, it seemed like they might argue, but then one of the other bikers moved closer, crossing his arms over his chest. His leather vest creaked with the movement. "We were just leaving anyway," the tall young man said, standing up quickly. His friends followed, grabbing their coffee cups. They moved to a small table near the door, as far from the bikers as they could get. Mike pulled out a chair at Frank's table and wiped it dry with a napkin from the dispenser. "Sir," he said, gesturing to the chair. "Your seat." Frank felt a lump in his throat. He walked to his table and sat down. The other bikers pulled up chairs, surrounding him like a wall. "Joe," Mike called to the owner, "can we get some fresh coffee over here? And something to eat?" He turned to Frank. "What do you like, sir?" "Apple Danish," Frank said, his voice a little rough. "But you don't have to." "5 coffees, black, and a Danish," Mike called out. He turned back to Frank. "My old man would kick my butt from beyond the grave if I didn't show proper respect to a chief." Frank looked around at the bikers sitting with him. They all had hard faces, the kind that had seen tough times, but their eyes were kind as they looked at him. "Tell us about the Nimitz," one of the younger bikers said. "My uncle was Navy too. Always told the best stories." Frank smiled a little. He hadn't really told his stories in a long time. Not since Tommy, Marissa's son, had asked for his history project. Frank looked across the coffee shop. The three young men were huddled at their small table, looking uncomfortable. The other customers were watching now, some with small smiles on their faces. "Well," Frank said, touching his Navy cap, "I started as a rescue swimmer in '69. The things I saw out on that water." As Frank began to speak, Mike and the other bikers leaned in to listen. Their faces showed real interest. For the first time in years, Frank felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. Here, surrounded by leather and tattoos instead of uniforms, he had found a kind of respect he thought was gone forever. For the next hour, the coffee shop filled with Frank's stories. His voice grew stronger with each one. He told them about the huge waves during the typhoon of '72, how they rose up like mountains of dark water. He described the feeling of jumping into the churning ocean to save 3 young sailors, tying himself to the ship with his belt so he wouldn't be swept away. "The water was so cold it burned," Frank said, his fingers wrapped around a fresh blue mug of coffee. "And so loud you couldn't hear a man screaming right next to you." The bikers listened with quiet respect. No one interrupted. When Frank spoke of the 27 men lost that day, Mike put a hand on his shoulder. "My old man told me about that storm," Mike said. "Said it was the worst he ever saw. Said the men who went in after the others were the bravest he ever knew." Frank looked down at his coffee. "Not brave enough. Couldn't reach them all." "You did what no one else could," Mike said firmly. Across the shop, the 3 young men watched and listened. The tall one had a strange look on his face, like he was seeing Frank for the first time. When Frank mentioned the Navy Cross hidden under his shirt, the young man's eyes widened. Frank didn't notice. He was back on the deck of the Nimitz, feeling the roll of the ship under his feet, smelling the salt and diesel in the air. The bikers nodded as he spoke, sometimes asking questions that showed they really cared about his answers. People came and went from the coffee shop, but many stayed longer than usual, listening from their tables. A young woman with a small child sat nearby, telling her daughter in a whisper, "That man is a hero. Listen to his story." When Frank finally fell silent, the coffee shop seemed different somehow. Warmer, more friendly. Even the light through the windows felt softer. "Sir," Mike said, "we have a veterans charity ride coming up this Saturday. Raises money for the VA hospital. Would do us a great honor if you'd join us." Frank blinked in surprise. "Me? I don't ride anymore. Bad hips." Mike smiled. "Got a buddy with a sidecar. Very comfortable. We'll pick you up right here." He pulled a card from his vest pocket and set it on the table. "My number. Anytime you need anything. Day or night." The 3 young men stood up from their table by the door. For a moment, Frank thought they might just leave, but the tall one walked slowly across the shop until he stood at the edge of Frank's table. His face was red with shame. "Sir," he said, his voice quiet now, not loud and mean like before, "I want to say I'm sorry. I was wrong. What you did matters." Frank looked up at him. The young man was just a boy, really. Maybe not so different from those sailors Frank couldn't save. Young and foolish, and thinking they knew everything. "We all make mistakes, son," Frank said. "The important thing is learning from them." The young man nodded, then walked quickly out of the shop, followed by his friends. The bell jingled as the door closed behind them. "Well," Mike said, checking his big silver watch. "We should get going too." He stood up, and the other bikers followed. "See you Saturday, Chief?" Frank nodded, a small smile on his face. "I'll be here." One by one, the bikers shook Frank's hand before walking out. Mike was the last to leave. At the door, he turned and gave Frank a sharp salute. Frank sat up straight and returned it, feeling the old pride flow through him again. After they left, Frank sat for a while longer. Marissa brought him a fresh Danish. "On the house," she said with a smile. Joe came by and put a hand on his shoulder. "You've got quite a fan club now, Frank," Joe said. Frank chuckled. "Never thought I'd be friends with Hell's Angels." "Good men come in all kinds of packages," Joe said. "See you tomorrow?" "Count on it," Frank replied. When Frank finally left the coffee shop, he walked a little taller than when he came in. The pain in his hips seemed less somehow. The air felt fresh in his lungs. He nodded to people he passed on the sidewalk, and they nodded back with new respect in their eyes. The next day, Frank returned to Joe's coffee shop. His table was empty, waiting for him. But something was different. A small sign sat on the table. It read, "Reserved for Chief Petty Officer Frank Matthews, USN, Reti." The sign was made of polished wood with brass corners. "Joe put that up this morning," Marissa told him as she brought his blue mug of coffee. "Said it was long overdue." On Saturday, the rumble of motorcycles filled the street outside the coffee shop. 5 Hell's Angels pulled up. One with a comfortable sidecar, just as Mike had promised. Frank walked out wearing his best Navy cap and the medal now proudly displayed on his chest. The ride through town was like nothing Frank had felt in years. The wind on his face made him feel young again. People on the sidewalks waved and smiled. At the VA hospital, other veterans greeted him with handshakes and salutes. Some of them were young, just back from far-off places Frank had never seen. But their eyes held the same look he knew from his own mirror. A week later, Frank sat at his table, reading his newspaper. The bell over the door jingled. Frank looked up to see Mike and 2 other bikers walk in. Behind them came the tall young man who had mocked Frank before. "Chief," Mike said with a nod, "this young man has something he wants to ask you." The young man stepped forward. In his hands was a small box wrapped in blue paper. "Sir," he said, his voice different now, more gentle. "Today is my brother's birthday. He's shipping out with the Navy next week. I was hoping, if it's not too much trouble, that you might share some wisdom with him, some advice to keep him safe." Frank folded his newspaper and smiled. "Pull up a chair, son," he said, tapping the table. "I've got a few stories he might want to hear."